My name is Francis Fukuyama. I'm a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. I'm in this somewhat difficult position of being the last speaker in, I think, what's been a very rich but rather long series of presentations. Not only that, I was asked to do two presentations. The original one was really a historical view of where tribalism fits in the evolution of human societies, which is something that I've looked at some length, but then also to relate it to the contemporary world and the rise of populism, global populism. And so I'm going to try to do both of those, but in the interest of the lateness of the hour, I'm going to try to do it as expeditiously as I can. All right? So tribalism has been used in the contemporary discussion of, world politics as a very broad term, meaning anybody that identifies with an in-group and doesn't like an out-group. I think that's such a broad definition, it becomes not all that useful. I, for historical purposes, have a much more specific definition of tribalism, which is a society that is organized into lineage segments based on descent from a common ancestor. And as some of the anthropologists earlier today said, oftentimes that is located as a stage of historical development between band-level societies, which are usually genetic relatives, maybe 50, altogether. That's the way Richard Wrangham's chimps organized themselves, wedged between that kind of society and state-level societies. And I think that's right. I think that what's interesting is that every human culture, virtually every human culture with some small exceptions, has gone through this kind of tribal level of development, moving from a band-level society to a tribal-level society. The basic reason that happens is a matter of power. And power is something we've not talked a lot about in the presentations earlier today, but militarily, a tribally organized society can beat a band-level society because it scales. You scale a tribal-level society by pushing the number of ancestors that you believe you're descended from to further and further generations back, and you can get very, very large groupings that think that they are related. It may be fictive kinship, but they think that they're related. It's encapsulated in that Bedouin saying, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousins against the outsider, right? So you can scale a tribal society, you can organize violence in a much more effective way, and that's why tribal societies began to and it also depended on things like the invention of agriculture that provided more resources, but this is why band-level societies were eventually displaced by tribal ones, but they in turn were generally displaced about 6,000 years ago by state-level societies. State-level societies are very different because they have a centralized source of power that tries to exert a monopoly of power. This is the famous Max Weber definition of a state. It's a legitimate monopoly of force over territory. Tribal societies have no tax collector. They have no ability to coercively extract resources from their societies. They have no standing armies. They have no centralized judicial system. Justice in a tribal society is a kind of negotiation between rival segments where if you kill somebody, you pay a penalty as a result of a negotiation between your kin group and the other kin group that was wrong. In the Germanic tribes that settled Europe, this was known as the Wehrgeld. But there's no justice system as such. States add all of that. They add a hierarchical monopoly of power that is able to enforce the state's will. It makes them much less egalitarian. Tribal societies are actually quite democratic in a certain sense. If you don't want to listen to the big man that's running your particular tribal segment, you take your kin and just wander off somewhere. There's no way to keep people, coercively employed in a single organization. States bring that with them. The kind of justification, the ideological justification is different because tribal societies really depend on a religious belief in the power of dead ancestors and unborn children to affect outcomes in the present. So if you, for example, have gone to Mexico at the time, late October, the Day of the Dead, you'll see Mexican families going to the grave of their ancestors with a six-pack of Tecate and some tortillas, leaving them in the cemetery because it comes from a pre-Columbian belief that, by the way, was true in China, it was true in India, it was true in ancient Greece and Rome, that the actual spirits of the ancestors are living in the ground where they're buried, and they get hungry. And if they don't get fed, they're going to be very angry, they're going to come back as ghosts, and they're going to haunt you in the present. State-level societies have to have a different ideological system in order to unite people at a much larger scale. State-level societies can have millions of people organized into a single social unit. Ancestor worship is not a sufficient ideology to encompass that, and that's why the growth of state-level societies was oftentimes associated with the growth of the so-called axial religions. If you think about a religion like Islam, it is an ideology that was designed to get the Arabs out of tribalism. Arab society was one of the most intensely tribally organized of any in the world. They could not cooperate, and therefore they were a very minor political player in the outskirts of the Byzantine and the Roman and Frankish empires, until the Prophet Muhammad comes and says, no, you're all part of a universal ummah. It's actually a kind of anti-tribal ideology that says that in God's eyes, everybody is equal. As a Muslim, it doesn't matter what tribal segment you come from, you are one of God's creatures. And it allowed the Arabs to then conquer, basically, most of the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East, because they could field large armies based on a much higher level, much more complex form of ideology. All right, so that's tribalism. We have some surviving tribes that are determined by geography and climatic conditions, but basically we all live in state-level societies. Now, in this discussion, we need to distinguish what is, in a sense, natural or part of our genetic heritage and what is socially constructed. And I think it's very important to keep those straight. There are evolutionary sources of contemporary behavior that I think the social psychologists have already identified. I would put them in a slightly different way. I think that they're clearly psychological, genetically based psychological mechanisms that provide for social cooperation. One of them is the principle of inclusive fitness that the biologist William Hamilton described. We are altruistic towards other people in proportion to the number of genes that we share, which explains our preference for close relatives. There's a principle of reciprocal altruism. Human beings on a face-to-face basis like to exchange gifts or favors, so we favor friends, but in a direct sort of way. Robert Trivers, the biologist, described this occurring not just among human societies, but even among different species of animals. I would say that Richard Wrangham noted, the difference between higher primates and human beings is really language. Language allows human beings to develop a capacity for norm generation. You can describe a norm in abstract terms because you have language, and it's also created a psychology of norm following. And so human beings are intensely conformist. The norms, take very complex forms. Every religion is an ideology. It's a set of ideas that establishes standards for normative behavior, and people invest a great deal psychologically in being loyal to those norms. I'm afraid, as some of our earlier speakers have indicated, violence, I don't think it comes from the outside of the human condition. It's deeply bred into human beings, especially into human males. Politics, political institutions, that's what I study, is the origin and evolution of political institutions. The reason we have political institutions is to control violence. That tendency towards violence would spin out of control if we did not have rules, if we didn't have institutions that constrain the behavior of people. Then finally, I would say there is an aspect of the human psyche that Plato described with the Greek word thumos. Thumos means something like pride or spiritedness when translated into English. And it really has to do with identity, a sense of identity, that human beings believe that they have an inner self, and they want that inner self to be respected. They want other human beings to acknowledge the dignity of that inner self, and if they do not get that recognition, they get very angry. It's tied directly to some very, very powerful human emotions of pride, guilt, shame, and anger. And all of these are social emotions that explain, I think, the kind of biological substrate on which human sociability is built. Now, that's the, you might say, the natural or evolutionary or biological part, but the definition of what constitutes an in-group is completely socially constructed. Nationalists and racists and a lot of other people that define in-groups in that fashion often assert that they are simply reverting to a natural, somehow, genetically determined category, and that is complete nonsense because all of those categories are socially constructed. I mean, for example, Bosnian Muslims and Serbian Christians, Orthodox Serbs, genetically there's no difference between them whatsoever. Just so happens the Bosnians were converted to Islam under Ottoman rule and they have a different religion. And yet the Serbs committed genocide against the Bosnian Muslims based on that difference. It was not rooted in biology whatsoever. Hutus and Tutsis, I mean, many of the horrible conflicts that we've seen, genocidal conflicts, are really not based on anything particularly biological. And so, if we want to understand something like the rise of populism, you can say, well, there are these general human characteristics that explain the basis of sociability, but it does not explain the particular forms that the in-groups take in different historical periods. That is completely dependent on contingent historical facts, economic forces, climate, geography, a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with nature or human nature or anything of the sort. All right, so now I'm going to get into the second part, which is the explanation of why we're now seeing the rise of populism today. But to explain that, I actually have to go back a little bit historically because this is not a new phenomenon. The way that human beings have been defining in-groups and out-groups has been changing, repeatedly and going in certain cycles over, the centuries. I'm only going to go back about 5 centuries or so, but just to illustrate the point that, again, these definitions are very variable. So if you think about Europe in the year 1500, it's divided among, maybe 1,000 different little principalities and princely states and so forth. There's a few larger dynasties and would-be empires, but it is united by a single universal Catholic Church. The Reformation happens early in the 16th century. Europe then organizes itself. It begins to define in-group and out-group in religious terms between Protestants and Catholics, between different wings of Protestantism, and so forth. And then Europe falls into 150 years of unremitting religious warfare that kills, something like 40% of the population of what's now the territory of Germany in the 30 Years' War. In 1648, you have the Peace of Westphalia, in which basically European princes say, okay, we're not going to fight over religion anymore. Every prince can determine the religious confession of his territory, and that is something that is not going to be the object of political struggle. And a new doctrine called liberalism is developed by people like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, where they basically say governments should not be about religion. They should not be defined by religious identity. We're going to push that into private life because we want to preserve the right to life. The right to life in the American Declaration of Independence actually comes from Thomas Hobbes in the experience of the English Civil War, in which lots of people were killed over religious passion. And he said that should be exiled from politics. We need, if you wanted to use a modern word, he'd say we need a more inclusive ideology that will allow Protestants and Catholics to live peacefully together, and we'll do that by making religion basically a matter of private confession. And so liberalism grows up in the Netherlands, in England, and again, the in-group is defined in terms of, universal rights, the rights of man, and so forth, all right? That's the first phase. Now, in the 19th century, you begin to have a shift out of that towards what I think is really the first form of modern identity politics, which is 19th century European nationalism. There are very specific reasons for this. Some of them are technological, like the invention of the printing press and other technologies that allow people to communicate over much larger social spaces, geographical spaces. But another of them was industrialization, because beginning in the 19th century, Europe, as it began to modernize economically, people left their little villages where they understood who they were. They were peasants that were living under a priest with their families. They had fixed confessions. They had fixed jobs. All of a sudden, they're working in a big city. They're living in a dormitory with people that are very different from them. They may speak other languages. They may have other religious outlooks. It's a very confusing and alienating world. Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, invented the word anomie to describe the sense of normlessness that accompanied that shift from village life to modern urban life. And that was really the source of nationalism, because what the nationalists could do is take a confused peasant that said, who the hell am I after all? Because I thought I was Hans living in this little village in Saxony, and all of a sudden I'm working in this big factory with a labor union and bosses and communist parties and all of this. And the nationalists said, I'll tell you who you are. You are a proud German. You're part of a linguistic group. And it also served an economic function, because a modern market economy requires a common language, a common culture by which workers and managers can communicate with one another and organize economic production on a much larger scale. And so in the 19th century, you have the rise of the kinds of national identities that came to, it's a modern phenomenon, this idea that your political unit should, the territory of your political unit should correspond to a cultural unit defined primarily by language. That is not the way Europe or most of the world was organized prior to the 19th century. But for the reasons, coming out of this need to have a common sustaining culture in an economically modernizing society with ever-expanding markets, European nationalism was born. This has the effect of creating 2 world wars, killing off a lot of the population of the countries that were contesting these national identities. And in 1945, the world, just like in 1648, says, okay, we're tired of this. We want to create a more liberal world order based on greater cooperation, free trade, liberal institutions, liberal international institutions that will foster both democracy within countries, liberal democracies that will be tolerant within their own societies, as well as an international global order that will allow trade and communications and migration and so forth. And that was the kind of liberal world order that we have been living in really for the last 70 years. And now I think, if you want to talk about the rise of populism, I think that is being fed by the strains that are being created by that liberal world order, because it has tended to, well, okay, so the conventional wisdom about why you're getting, okay, so what is populism? So populism are publicly or popularly elected officials who use their democratic legitimacy for having been elected to basically undermine the liberal institutions of their liberal democracies, because they say the people elected me to carry out the people's wishes. I personally am the embodiment of that popular will, and if there's a judge or a bureaucracy or a media that is standing in my way, I am going to do what I can to undermine that. And this is what has been happening now in any number of countries around the world, shifting from a liberal form of organization to one based on a much narrower form of identity. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, re-elected as prime minister in 2011, begins to weaken the Hungarian court system. He puts the Hungarian mainstream media under the control of his crony friends, and he says Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity. And of course, not everybody in Hungary is an ethnic Hungarian. Moreover, there's lots of ethnic Hungarians in many of the surrounding countries, and so that is not a formula either for internal toleration or for international peace in the long run. So that's gone on there. It's gone on in Poland. It's happened now with, well, actually Salvini is out of power, but populist government was elected in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and I think most shockingly in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, and in Britain with the vote for Brexit, both of which were powered by populist movements that had exactly the same structure. So Donald Trump comes into office saying, mainstream media is the enemy of the American people. He attacks his own intelligence community. He attacks his own Justice Department and FBI because it gets in the way of his own personal interests. And so, like populists in other parts of the world, he is anti-institutional, and he's also trying to redefine American national identity, I think, returning it to a kind of ethnic definition. Now, there are other movements, identity-based movements, similar to that don't necessarily use nation as the mobilizing principle. So, for example, in India, Prime Minister Modi is the head of the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party. Modern India was created as a liberal state, a secular state, and he wants to change that identity to one based on Hinduism, which again is very problematic because it excludes the 150, 200 million Muslims living in that country. In Sri Lanka and Myanmar, you have a militant Buddhist movement that is highly intolerant of people like the Rohingya in the Rakhine state, have driven them out, basically committed a genocide against them because, again, they are reverting to a very specific and narrower religious identity that does not have room for some of the other religious confessions there. And so this is a shift that has been taking place in many countries around the world, including some of the oldest and most consolidated democracies, namely Britain and the United States. And I think that it is very much, so as I said, the conventional wisdom explaining why this sort of thing is happening tends to be economic. It's a reaction to globalization. I'm sure that you've heard versions of this argument. Globalization made everybody richer, but it concentrated wealth in the hands of a kind of narrow oligarchic class in country after country. Ordinary people, and particularly working class people in rich countries, found their jobs being outsourced to low-wage workers in China, India, Vietnam, and so forth. And so that, I think is part of the explanation, and it does explain why this is happening, in 2016 and not 10 years prior or 15 years prior or something like that. But the identity part, I think, is underestimated as a driver of that because economic status is actually seen as a marker of social status. If I have a job, it means that my society respects me enough to pay me for what I do, and if I lose my job, it means I've lost that degree of respect. It also is very much based on a narrowing of one's sense of what the community is that one is trying to protect. And so if you listen to the rhetoric of the right-wing populists, it is really that they, meaning these foreigners and these elites that are supporting them, are trying to steal our country. They're trying to take our country away from us. And by our country, what that oftentimes means is a country that is defined in ethnic terms. And, the consequences of this, I think, for the survival of, liberal democracy are pretty clear. So I'm going to end, again, because it's late. The one thing I want to leave you with, though, is the following, that, as I said, these tendencies towards in-groups and out-groups may be based on evolved human characteristics that are very deeply bred into our psyches. But the definitions of what constitutes the in-group and out-group are completely socially constructed. And as you can see, over the generations and centuries, they've changed from broader ones to narrower ones. The narrower ones usually end up in conflict. They end up in conflict, and for that reason, we design political institutions to deliberately broaden the sense of what the nation is, for example, to make it more inclusive, to make it more tolerant. That was the origin of liberalism in the 17th century, and it is the basis of the liberalism that appeared after 1945. And because these things are socially constructed, I think in a way that's what gives you hope, because we're not somehow reverting to an atavistic biology that is inevitably going to make us racist and xenophobic and whatnot. If you have the right kinds of institutions and if you have the right kind of political leadership, you can redefine those identities and you can make them broader and more inclusive rather than narrow and xenophobic. And I think that's what we've got to do politically, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world. So thank you very much.